initiating development with a flexible piece, preparing for central pawn advances or wing attacks, steering the game into diverse middle game structures. Preparing the fianchetto, a flexible approach, opens lines for the bishop and reinforces the kingside's pawn structure. Carving out central space and preparing a queenside pawn advance immediately challenges black's fianchetto. Unleashing the fianchetto bishop asserts kingside control, mirroring white's central ambitions. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, nc3 also eyes the d5 square, hinting at potential pawn advances. Immediately challenging the center with c5 aims for a Maroczy-bind structure, potentially limiting white's queenside expansion. Unleashing a central pawn thrust seizes initiative, creating immediate positional tension across the board and forcing black to react. Liberating the d-pawn opens lines, creating dynamic counterplay and challenging white's central grip. Reclaiming the center with the knight immediately pressures black's queenside pawn structure. Developing the knight to its most active square, this piece now supports the central pawn structure and eyes key squares. Opening the diagonal for the queen and preparing to develop the bishop to a more active square, this maneuver aims to consolidate white's central pawn structure and create potential threats on the queen side. Securing that knight's advance and preparing to castle are solid goals for black, though it does invite white to potentially seize central space. Developing the kingside pieces harmoniously is a good idea, but watch out for any isolated pawns that might arise from this pawn structure. Developing the bishop to e2 solidifies the kingside and prepares to castle, a crucial step in securing the king's safety and activating the rook for central control. This move also subtly discourages immediate pawn breaks from black on the kingside, offering white a more tranquil development path while maintaining pressure on the d4 pawn. Securing the monarch amidst the arising pawn structure and potential central skirmishes is a fundamental priority, wisely prioritized here. Castling secures the monarch, bringing the rook into the game's central theater where it can soon eye open files, a prudent decision to avoid premature king exposure amidst this developing pawn skirmish. Trading off the knight in the center immediately addresses white's central pawn majority and opens the d-file for potential queen infiltration, though it also allows white to recapture and develop their bishop to a more active diagonal. Consider the long-term implications for piece activity. Reclaiming the center with the queen immediately challenges black's queenside pawns, forcing a decision about their pawn structure and potentially opening lines for further attack, all while solidifying the d-file. Black solidifies the center and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, aiming to untangle its pieces and challenge white's central pawn on d4. Shifting the queen from the center to a more defensive square like d2 creates a more robust pawn shield for the king and prepares to potentially support a queenside expansion with the c-pawn. This also aims to avoid any immediate tactical skirmishes involving the queen, opting instead for a measured positional buildup. Developing the bishop to e6 gracefully repositions this piece, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn breaks like e5 or b6. It subtly seeks to unburden the kingside and offers a degree of queenside counterplay by eyeing the d5 square. Retrieving the queen to the second rank after the capture and recapture secures the pawn on c4 and prepares for potential kingside action, while also keeping an eye on the queenside. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvering on that flank. This move subtly restricts white's bishop on c1 and lays groundwork for a queenside expansion. Refocusing on the queenside after black's prophylactic a6, white's bd2 discreetly tucks the bishop away, preparing to develop the queenside pieces and solidify white's central presence. The bishop now eyes the c3 knight and potentially supports a future e4 pawn push. Asserting control over the open c-file is the primary objective here, preparing to challenge white's piece development and potentially create pressure along that crucial vertical. Swinging the queen to the edge, white prepares to apply pressure along the queen side, potentially eyeing the weak b7 pawn and looking to disrupt black's pawn structure if they commit to b5, while simultaneously eyeing the c-file. Awakening the knight from its slumber on d7 aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queen side, while also offering a flexible retreat if the c6 square becomes compromised by white's active queen. White maneuvers the queen to a seemingly active square, but its repositioning subtly shifts the battleground, now eyeing the queenside structure and potentially creating opportunities for a queenside pawn push, while simultaneously preparing for further piece development or the eventual opening of lines for attack against black's somewhat passive setup. Pushing that pawn to a5 simultaneously challenges white's queen and aims to pry open the queenside for black's pieces, creating a potential outpost for the knight on c5. Shifting the queen again addresses the potential pressure on the queen side, aiming to re-establish some equilibrium and keep options open, although it surrenders the bishop pair and concedes a slight structural vulnerability on the queen side. Shifting the knight to this advanced outpost disrupts white's pawn structure and aims to pry open the kingside by threatening to infiltrate squares like d3 or c4, forcing white to react defensively rather than continuing their queenside expansion. Stepping onto d5, the knight immediately seeks to dominate the central squares and probe for weaknesses in black's pawn structure, especially eyeing the c6 and e7 squares, which are now less defended. Initiating a bold queenside expansion, black seeks to untangle their pieces and disrupt white's central grip by creating an immediate queenside presence. Seizing the pawn on b5 immediately grants white a material advantage and opens up lines for the queen, but it also potentially isolates that queen on the queen side, making it a target. Black's response with a pawn push aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain space on the queen side, forcing white to reconsider their attacking posture and potentially defend their newly acquired material. The queen's repositioning becomes crucial now. Can it find safety or continue its disruptive influence, or will it become a liability? The rook's sudden appearance on the b-file immediately challenges white's queen and aims to disrupt its comfortable patrol, creating crucial tempo while simultaneously preparing for a potential pawn advance on the queen side. White's queen now occupies the a5 square, creating significant threats along the fifth rank and indirectly putting pressure on black's queenside structure. This aggressive positioning aims to disrupt black's coordination, forcing concessions or creating immediate tactical opportunities. Black must now carefully address the threat to the bishop on g7 and the potential for white's queen to infiltrate further. The exchange of queens seems likely soon, but the temporary advantage of the queen's advanced placement could prove decisive if black doesn't react precisely. A bold pawn sacrifice aiming to disrupt white's queenside and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it invites immediate tactical complications. Focusing on centralizing the bishop and eyeing the weak dark squares around black's king, this maneuver aims to exploit the open c-file and potentially pressure black's pawn structure. Black repositions the queen to connect rooks and prepare for potential central pawn advances, while also keeping an eye on the weakened kingside squares. White seeks to activate the rook and contest the crucial c-file, aiming to dismantle black's queenside pressure before it escalates further. Reasserting presence on the open file, black aims to disrupt white's queenside initiative, turning the focus back to the central battleground and potentially exploiting the pawn structure white has created. Instead of shoring up its position, white opts to reinforce the bishop's influence on the queen side, creating a more robust defensive shield around the monarch while simultaneously eyeing potential breakthroughs along the queenside files. The knight's sacrifice fundamentally reshapes the pawn structure and opens new avenues of attack, shifting the game's complexion from a quiet positional struggle to a dynamic tactical melee. Accepting this doubled pawn structure, while admittedly ugly, opens the g-file and potentially creates attacking chances against black's castled king, a dynamic trade-off for weakened central pawn control. The doubled pawns on the kingside created by white's last move present an immediate target, and black wisely capitalizes by eliminating the knight that was so effectively guarding them, initiating a critical positional exchange. The double-edged nature of white's queen now becomes apparent. It's a powerful attacking piece, yet vulnerable to precise counterplay, particularly with that pawn on g3 disrupting the king's safety. Seizing the open c-file after the pawn capture is the immediate priority for black, disrupting white's queen's safety and forcing a response. Unlocking the c-file, this rook redeployment prepares to exploit white's compromised kingside pawn structure, forcing black to confront a potentially awkward battery along the open column. Opening up the c-file with the rook not only forces white's queen to find a new square, but also aims to exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses, potentially setting up an infiltration or a future exchange sacrifice. Initiating a decisive attack on the enemy king's immediate vicinity, this forcing check aims to exploit black's slightly exposed monarch and disrupt any immediate defensive setup. The discovered threat on the rook adds a layer of complexity, demanding precise calculation from black to avoid further material loss or a compromised position. The king now ventures out, seeking safer pastures on the kingside, a necessary but precarious step given the open lines and the active queen still bearing down. Unleashing the f-pawn here carves open the kingside, creating an attacking avenue but simultaneously weakening your own monarch's sanctuary and leaving the g-file exposed. Initiating a daring counterattack, black endeavors to exploit the exposed white king and the potentially doubled pawns on the g-file by repositioning the rook to a more active square, aiming to create threats on the 7th rank and disrupt white's pawn structure. Seizing control of the open c-file is paramount here, and RFC1 perfectly embodies that initiative, preparing to apply relentless pressure on black's queenside structure. Unleashing a desperate check, black probes white's still uncastled monarch, hoping to exploit the exposed e-file and create some defensive chaos. The white king, now exposed on the f-file following the capture of its pawn shield, embarks on a perilous journey to the center of the board, a decision driven by the immediate threat of a devastating discovered check, a maneuver that fundamentally alters the defensive structure. Reclaiming the a5 square, the rook now stands poised to exploit the open c-file, creating a dual threat along the rank and potentially pressuring white's king should it venture too far from its protective pawns. Reclaiming the initiative by challenging the advanced queen forces a crucial decision, potentially simplifying the position or leading to further tactical complications depending on black's response. A desperate gambit attempting to exploit the open g-file and target the exposed white king, but it leaves the black queen in a precarious, overextended position. The king boldly steps into the line of fire, aiming to escape the immediate checks and perhaps find a safer haven behind the pawn wall, but it exposes itself to further tactical skirmishes on the open diagonals. Exploiting the undefended rook on a 2, black aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create an immediate pawn threat on the queenside. Shifting the queen away from the compromised kingside allows white to concentrate defensive forces on the d-file, aiming to prevent black's rook from becoming too active. The astute black queen ventures forth, injecting immediate forcing play that complicates white's king's safety and demands a precise defensive response. White's queen repositions, seeking a safer haven from the immediate checks and preparing to potentially regroup or support an attack from a more stable square, even if it means sacrificing a bit of queenside initiative. Exploring the initiative, black redirects the queen's pressure to the kingside, potentially setting up a future attack against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Pushing the e-pawn now opens diagonals for the bishop and king, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially create counterplay on the kingside, a gamble in this tense positional struggle. A daring infiltration, black's rook now plunges into the enemy's back rank, threatening to disrupt white's entire structure. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the f-file, white seeks to disrupt black's king's safety and potentially open lines for attack after the exchange sacrifice on the queenside. The black queen's maneuver to h4 opens a potential diagonal assault on white's king, threatening to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after white's doubled f-pawns. The rook's repositioning to the 3rd rank aims to bolster the beleaguered king's defenses, offering an escape square and preparing a potential counterattack along the open file if black commits to an aggressive kingside assault. The seemingly simple capture unleashes a torrent of potential complications, fundamentally altering the board's tactical landscape by forcing the king into a precarious central position and opening lines that were previously sealed. Opening the F-file finally unlocks white's pieces for potential action, but it comes at the cost of a compromised king's shelter, leaving it exposed to black's aggressive queen and knight. A bold maneuver, Re5 seeks to exploit the open files and create counterplay on the queen side, leveraging the pawn on E3's potential weakness by offering a piece exchange to simplify and activate its own rook. Introducing new attacking potential down the F-file, this advance seeks to exploit the exposed black king and the open nature of the position. The immediate threat to the C3 rook is now palpable, forcing white to prioritize its defense, potentially at the cost of further material or positional concessions.